Mr. Bison flips!
Mr. Bison flips! Mr. Bison flips! Mr. Bison flips!
Today we're going to have a look at Percy Shelley's poem Ozymandias and how that represents ideas of identity. The poem is a sonnet, though not maybe a traditional sonnet in its form entirely, because we don't have the traditional, it's certainly not Italian Petrarchan, it's more Shakespearean in its structure and its rhyme scheme, but we don't have that consistent octave sestet with a volta in between that we may have in what we might call a normal sonnet. However, there is, I guess, a shift in thinking or a shift in approach after the first 8 lines. I'm not going to go into the long-winded explanation of how Ozymandias is a Greek translation of the actual name of Ramses II, one of the pharaohs of Egypt. The identity of Ramses per se, and the history of Keats and his friend writing two sort of conflicting sonnets about Ramses II, I'm not going to go into because for our purposes of focusing on identity, that doesn't necessarily matter. So rather than that, I'm going to start by looking at the different identities that are represented in the poem. And it's quite an interesting poem because there are so many layers of complexity, but also layers of various identity laid on top of this poem. If we start off with, there's obviously the poet Percy Shelley, who's speaking, who's created a speaker in the poem who's talking to us, right? So there's already 3 layers there in terms of the poet is trying to make a message through a speaker, and he's trying to get that message across to us. So all those 3 people will affect, obviously only the speaker of those 3 is represented in the poem. The speaker is actually only present in the first line of the poem. He then disappears, and instead he is replaced by another narrator who is someone from an antique land, who's just returned from travels in an antique land. And he, in his turn, is telling us the story, or is telling the speaker the story, about a sculpture he has seen, which has been made by a sculptor of the ancient king Ozymandias. So there's the identity of all those characters laid on top of each other through this poem, right? The speaker, this person the speaker is talking to, who's actually telling the story, and then obviously what the sculpture itself is saying, primarily about the sculptor, and then how does that affect Ozymandias, the ruler who's being represented. So if we look at how that shapes the poem as such, we always obviously get all these different layers, right? We get initially a speaker who appears quite objective, quite unaffected, but because he's chosen the form of a sonnet, it's saying something about how he's sticking to tradition, he's being adherent to tradition, and he's showing some sense of reverence and respect, because that is traditionally what you do in a sonnet. But his role is primarily just to tell us that he met a traveller from an antique land, and then from then on, it's about what this traveller has told him. So if we look at what we learn about this traveller, we get the sense that he's someone who reports fact quite neutrally. He's looking at a very grand destruction of the statue, but is also emphasizing the loss and the emptiness that remains. We get that through the last 3 lines. The round of the round the decay of the colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. And I think that the combination here of the alliteration of boundless and bare and lone and level, as well as maybe the adjectives, or the adjective colossal wreck, but also maybe the diction of decay and how the level sands stretch far away, shows that emptiness that now ensues after the King Ozymandias is gone. So contrasting this, reverent and respectful persona who is the initial speaker and the slightly awestruck and maybe longing traveller who's told us about the distraction. In contrast to those two, the other two personas in the poem, the sculptor and the ruler Ozymandias, are very different. If we start with the sculptor, he comes across as maybe a bit tongue-in-cheek, a bit disrespectful almost, in the way that he has represented his king. And I think the main place where we see this slightly mocking aspect is in that highlighted yellow line in the middle, which I think is probably the most difficult line in the poem. It's slightly ambiguous. Presumably it's referring to the sculptor who's mocking Ozymandias' passions, and if so, he's also mocking the heart that fed those same passions, right? Furthermore, the fact that he's represented Ozymandias with a wrinkled lip and a sneer of cold command is both highly visual images that show us that this is a man full of disdain and arrogance, and the sculpture obviously is stressing that aspect rather than the benevolent ruler who we all would like to look up to and respect. So in both these regards, the sculptor is quite interesting in that he has sort of two identities. Obviously, his public persona, what he would have shown King Ozymandias, would have been something submissive, something reverent, someone who respects and is awestruck by his king. But as we can see, the way he sculpts and the way he's managed to make this almost caricature of the king shows that underneath that there's a different side. So it's kind of interesting in terms of his two identities and how we use one to cover up another. Lastly, we're going to look at the king himself, Ozymandias, the king of kings even, and how he's obviously seen by the sculptor, the way he's presented by the sculptor, someone who's quite arrogant and strong and powerful, even though the sculptor has mocked those features. And we get that obviously both in the way that he looks with the wrinkled lip and the sneer of cold command that we talked about before. But also obviously in the quotation underneath on the pedestal of the statue, and the now destroyed wreck of a statue, where we get the quote from the king: "My name is Ozymandias, king of king. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Obviously the words of someone who is really impressed by their own power, highly arrogant and highly oblivious to anyone around them. So what's interesting then obviously is to contrast this arrogant, indestructible, powerful character with what remains today, which is nothing besides that shattered visage that we described in the early part of the poem. He's got two vast and trunkless legs of stone standing alone in the desert, and on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies. So that's all we have left of him, right? Two legs, no body, no trunk, and a couple of shattered pieces of his face. So when it comes to the king himself, it's interesting, I guess, in terms of identity, to look at the fact that the difference between his perception of himself and the way he is actually perceived by other people, and the fact that he's so self-deluded and believes that he's so much greater than others. But obviously, people who are ruled by fear can counteract and be subversive in the way that the sculptor has been in making the sculpture. So therein lies the essence of this rather paradoxical King of Kings, Ozymandias. That's as far as I intend to go today. I'm sure that's given you a bit of an overview of the ways you can talk about identity in this particular poem, and I will leave the rest of the exploration to you alone. Best of luck.